Welcome to this professional development workshop on crafting effective teaching cases from concept to application. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Wie Yusuf. I'm a professor in the School of Public Service at Old Dominion University, and I also lead ABFM's professional development activities. So you might expect to see more announcements and emails from me about professional development workshops that are coming up. Welcome, and I just wanted to give you a quick overview of this workshop. What we're trying to do is equip all of you with the knowledge and skills to write effective teaching cases for use in public budgeting and or financial management courses. We held an online virtual webinar in the spring that talked about using teaching cases in the classroom. And one of the things that came out of that workshop was very much that faculty struggle to find appropriate cases. They're not as widely available. And so one of the kind of concluding discussions was that we really need to be writing more cases, not just for our use in our own classes, but that our colleagues can use in their classes as well. And so that was really kind of the impetus for this. My goal, or our goal for the workshop, is for you to come out of this workshop with an idea of maybe a teaching case that you'd like to develop further, based on kind of the input and what you're hearing from the faculty experts in this panel discussion that will kick us off. Then we'll give you time to work through the development of that idea, talking to your colleagues, coming up kind of with an action plan so that it's not just, oh, here's my idea, but maybe having more concrete steps to follow through. And then we are looking to solicit later down the road from those who participated and others these teaching cases that we can include as kind of a compilation in either a teaching case book or maybe in a journal special issue. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But our goal is not just to have these teaching cases in isolation, but then to kind of compile them and have them readily available and accessible to faculty who could use them and benefit kind of the pedagogy in their classrooms. So I have 4 faculty experts who are here to kind of provide some of that insight, and then we'll kind of open it up for y'all to work and maybe solicit some feedback from your colleagues and from our faculty experts. But I wanted to maybe give our panelists a quick opportunity to quickly introduce yourself, and then we'll go right into the discussion. So Bruce, kick us off.
Hi, I'm Bruce McDonald. I'm at NC State, but only temporarily because I moved to Old Dominion in December. I'm the editor of Public Administration and the co-editor of Public Finance Journal.
I don't know. I need to say who I am.
Everybody should know.
Yes, if you don't, I would be very disappointed. But yes, I'm a local host of ABFM this year. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all for making this event successful. And I am an associate professor here in Leland School at Leland State University.
I'm Suzanne, Leland. I'm at University of North Carolina, Charlotte.
Thurmaier at Northern Illinois University.
All right, well, thank you. So to kick us off, I wanted to just kind of start with a quick overview discussion about different types of teaching cases. And those of you who have used cases in your classroom are probably already familiar with this. But I've asked Kurt to just kind of introduce the 2 types of cases to kind of give us a flavor of what potentially are out there.
So the 2 types of cases are cases where something has already happened, and then you have the students analyze what happened and come up with what they might have done differently, or what are the key theories that might explain, and so on. So you kind of dissect a case of things that's already happened. The other kind of case, which I much prefer, is one where you write a case and it may actually be a fictionalized version of something that actually happened, but you chop it off before the decision point, so that now they don't know what actually happened, and the students discuss and figure out how that works.
And so Kurt's already talked about his preference for the kind of the hanging case where you have your students kind of at that threshold and now they actually have to help make the decision. But I'm gonna, and he's already explained why, so I'm gonna ask Susie, kind of what types of cases do you use and why?
Well, I like the hanging case too. I approach it a little differently. So one of the ways I get my cases is a little different probably, because instead of going off of, talking to people or interviewing people or experiencing things myself, I do news bank searches. There's about 90,000 different governments. So I do local governments usually. And so what you think might be unusual in your particular town is probably something you're going to have to deal with in any town or something similar. Maybe there might be a couple components of the cases that are different. So I research mine, and I base them on what's called mundane realism, pretty much like if you ever do vignette experiments. You want to make sure that they're realistic enough that they're going to happen. And so I usually, pick the area I'm looking for, and then I'll do these extensive searches, and I'll find a group of articles that examine something that happened. In this case, the budgeting in a town. Maybe it's cutbacks, maybe it's embezzlement, maybe it's something else. But look at what happens, and then it could even be like multiple elected officials that share power in a local government, like a sheriff in a county, but a county manager, whatever. So I'll find these different configurations and find a common incident. I might make it a little flavorful with common trends, but so like the pandemic was one that was using a lot of things because we were going through the pandemic, labor shortages, that kind of stuff. So that's how I approach it.
Well, I guess I'm the next one, and in opposite to our first two panelists, I really prefer narrative cases. I think the issue with narrative cases is that there are not too many out there. So if you try to find a case study that you would really want to discuss on a specific topic, the chances are kind of slim that you'll get across that case study. So I've written a few of these case studies myself, and I'm in a project of writing a lot more, but I think it's really interesting from my perspective to learn word from real experiences, real situations, and how maybe budget officials, tax officials have to go and resolve certain budgetary issue or tax issue, or even social issue. So this is the essence of narrative case studies. And I think both of them have a value. I use simulations, a couple simulations in my budgeting.
Minor inheritance is the simulation.
Okay. So I use a couple of budgeting simulations in my classes, and they're all fake, right? We have fake city and fake individuals and fake roles, and we try to put the budgets together and debates. And, so it's not like you only have to stick with one. There is a variety, and by saying that I really like real world situations, it doesn't mean that I never use the other hypothetical situations. I think there is a big value in both.
So first I'll say she's being modest. It's not just a project on the case, where she's doing some cases. She has a book under contract on case studies, so look out for that next year sometime whenever she finishes it. For me, I'm kind of in the middle between what I like. I think of a case study as kind of like a story where you have your intro, you have your climax, then all of a sudden everything like drops off and you see what happens and concludes. When I write the case study, I'll give it using a real life scenario of what's happened, and they'll get the front half, so they get all the way to the climax, and then they talk through kind of what they would like to do, how they think they could handle it, and then we talk the after part afterwards of going, well, here's how the practitioners did it. And it gives you kind of this opportunity to kind of come back and reflect, is there a way that you could have done it different, that is what the practitioners did in real life better, is it worse, what did they learn from it? And so it kind of gives a nice opportunity to kind of bounce back and forth for different perspectives. The challenge in doing them on real life is finding those case studies. At least in North Carolina and South Bend in Indiana before I got to North Carolina, I had a number of practitioners who had graduated from the MPA program who were always very eager to come back and talk to students. And so usually I would have them come in and they're providing, here's the story and experience of what they had assigned as a budget director or as a city manager related to the budget to one of their staff, and they're providing that real kind of contextual case study in person, which I think works really well in terms of providing a realistic understanding, connecting the students with people in the governments in the area. They're not always willing to then help take it and write it down someplace. Sometimes they just don't have time, sometimes concerned about what that might mean for their communities. And so, even if you're using a real situation, there is definitely an advantage, like Kurt said, of kind of taking it and blinding it a little bit. But just because you blind it doesn't mean you still can't use a real government out there, but you can kind of hide it so that we don't accidentally get any practitioners in trouble down the line.
And I think that's my point is, so the cases I've written are really based on my own experience. So, for example, I became the chair of my church finance committee down in Kansas, and first month, I get a call from the business officer that this pipe is broken and it almost wiped out the office and the office machine and so on, and turns out there's no capital improvement plan, and this is the oldest continuous church in Kansas, has all this stuff going wrong. So I ended up writing a case about church. So I changed the name a little bit and so on and so forth. But in the end, the students have to develop a 5 or 10 year capital improvement plan to identify the revenues that are going to pay for things, and think about those short term and the long term. How do you define capital? All that stuff is built into what I had to do with my team, and I had to stop using that. I taught that case from 1995 till about 2015, when I realized that the students don't go to church. They have no idea how churches work. This terminology was so foreign to them that they were like, what does this mean? And they would just do bizarre things. So I stopped teaching them. Well then, the Bill Hanahan, who's the CFO for St. Charles, Illinois, started teaching budgeting for us as an adjunct. I said, and the ICMA casebook is coming out for local government, and they needed budgeting cases. So I said, Bill, how about if we take my Pilgrim Church capital budgeting case, of which there are hardly any capital budgeting cases out there, and we turn it into St. Charles, which is now called Fox Falls, to Bruce's point. But it basically takes their issues, their big events, and now people are going to we're going to be teaching it this fall. Will be my first time teaching it in a couple of weeks. But it's a real city. It's a real list of real projects. But you don't know where it is. You just know it's on the river. But you can write it in these cases out of your experience, or the experience you had with a student. And practitioners are very reluctant to get into this stuff. First, they have imposter syndrome. They don't feel like they're qualified to do this kind of thing. So you have to be really like, I can help you. I'll do all of that. You just tell me X, Y, and Z, and then you can find amazing things that you can turn into teaching cases. So I know that there's another case, Lone Pine Contracting, which I use, which came out of the teaching case. Evans School used to host a case teaching workshop way back when, which I got to go to. An Albanian sent it to me when I was a young assistant professor. And Harvey was another guy in there. And he wrote a teaching case out of his experience in Little Lone Pine, Texas. So that case is, Gelt Theater case. There's all these cases are out there. Many of them are real incidents that are just fictionalized. And you probably have students, practitioners, alumni that you can call on to if you want to have a case that you can't find out, just ask your alums.
And if I can,
Go ahead.
if I can add a few sentences on that, on what Bruce said and Kurt elaborated on, it is definitely a lot of personal experiences, right? And we all, over time, we all get these experiences. We all learn stories. Just a matter of putting them into writing. So that book that Bruce mentioned, for example, it will include a couple case studies about internal control violations. And this come from, I used to take my students to the capital, Ohio, Columbus, for meetings with the auditor's office, state auditor's office of budget and management, so and other entities heavily involved in budgeting and financial controls. So every time that we would go there, my students, when I asked them for feedback, the absolute favorite meeting of all would be presentations from the special audit division. So special audits is the division that looks into violations, right? They get a hint that something doesn't look right, something doesn't right. So a couple of these case studies are the stories that the head of the special audit division shared with me. Tomorrow morning, I mentioned in the previous session, I'm presenting a couple of case studies from Cuyahoga County. One is on budgeting for vacancies, and another one is on accounting basis, and the use of accounting basis in budgeting practices. So this came up from my conversations, my discussions with the Cuyahoga County former executive of the county, and budget director of the county, and finance director of the county. And when I heard the stories, I was like, oh, I should definitely put it in writing. And my experience was people want to share these stories because they're not in the newspapers, or maybe newspapers or media reflect them, not from the perspective, because they don't know what's the essence of the stories. So I'm not saying it's always the case, but often people want to be heard, they want to share the stories. And this is another opportunity for this narrative case studies.
So our panels have kind of hopefully given you some ideas for where to start thinking about, kind of the basis for your teaching cases. So we're kind of going to transition a little bit. My prompt to the panelists, I asked them to think about one or two key elements of successful teaching cases and how those are things that you should consider as you write out and develop your teaching cases. So I'm actually going to start from the other end and have Bruce kind of start with his examples of kind of how you can structure or develop successful teaching cases.
So I think what makes something a successful teaching case. There's really in my mind two things. One, it has to relate back to budget and finance and some kind of decision-making process in some kind of way. But as previously I was the co-editor of the Journal of Public Affairs Education, and we would have people submit case studies quite frequently that there's no kind of like application. So it's just really, here's this thing that happened, and we're calling it a case study. You're looking about that decision-making process that forces kind of students. You're looking for it to happen in a budget and finance kind of context. The other thing is thinking about kind of the parts of a story where you have the introduction, you have your kind of background section, you're eventually building to that rise and that climax. Kind of starting and thinking about what you want that climax to be. So what's that decision-making process? Where is it going to? And then kind of thinking from that point and then working backwards. So when you're thinking about looking at stories, the instances in your community, you're looking at that climax point that you're aware of it, and so you have to kind of start filling in the gaps of what are the rest of the parts of that story. Without having that kind of key turning point where they're forced to make decisions, forced to work through something, you're really just kind of having this nice little short story that you kind of force students to read and go, okay, well, that's nice, and then let's move on. So really having that hook that is forcing them to engage the material, I think is probably the biggest key in my mind.
I would First, it's important to provide background information, right, and then get into the story itself and what happened. And again, there are narrative and case studies where you discuss certain situation, right? So in this narrative case studies, sometimes you provide the entire picture, and sometimes you stop at some decision point, and you ask your students, your readers, to think about the situation and how will they resolve that issue, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be hypothetical. It can be a real life story, but make sure it was not publicized, right? So they cannot find the answer. And even if there is, they can find the answer. I mean, we're talking about budgeting, right? It can be so many different options, so many different answers. So in these case studies, to me, the question was, which information do I hold on to, and which information do I put in writing, right? Which data. But I think an important element is to have this little, in Russian we say present, something, a sweet point that makes the story really interesting and cool. And another thing, I think case studies shouldn't be long from my perspective, because they should be interesting and they should catch the interest. And if you ask people to read 50 pages, I think they're getting lost in the information, the details. So to me, the best case studies, 3 pages, 4 pages, 5, even at most. Yeah.
The ICMA has a good model of cases that they've been doing for decades, and so I've been teaching. I'm really a consumer of cases first, and I've been teaching with cases my whole career, and I've used all kinds of different ones, from when we had the electronic hallway to the old ICMA Banovitz books for local government to Kennedy case studies or other ones, like just no matter what I'm teaching. And so, a couple things I try to do with my classes, and this is important when you're writing the case, is to get them to understand value trade-offs between things like efficiency and effectiveness and equity and so forth. Identify one single person that has to make a decision. You can have their decision usually give a little pressure on it of time, where they have to decide something quickly for a reason. A meeting's coming up, they have to have something to their boss or whatever, there's a deadline. Budgets are cyclical, and especially at the state and local level, they gotta go through a cycle. And so it's good to have those things in mind. But then also, don't forget to, develop characters beyond just the internal people in the agency that are working. You need to have a public views, or maybe it's emails commissioners are receiving, but websites that someone started something. But what are the issues in the community? What is the context of what going on when this case is happening? Where they're just like a major employer just laid off a lot of people, and so you're having budget cuts. Is it the situation where it's COVID-19 and people aren't coming to work anymore, and there's revenue shortages in different areas? I mean, what are the external factors affecting the case? And you don't even have to tell the students how those external factors affect the case. Let them figure it out. That's part of the exercise. So you give them, in your background, you give them not only like the key decision maker and who else is involved in the process, but always give them a perspective of the public or voters or some kind of other perspective in there, and then where they have to get at like the public interest. So like, maybe this is the most efficient thing to do, but people don't necessarily see it that way, and in certain areas, police, fire, schools, a whole host of things that can be kind of untouchable or hot button issues. So you want to be able to get these dynamics going on. don't be afraid to use interest groups. We never think about interest groups, but they're always there, right? And when there's a big policy decision to be made, they show up and they voice their opinion. More importantly, they give money to campaigns, right? And they may have a lot of different factors influencing the case. So make sure you're capturing that realistic context. And it's fun because you can use that realistic, kind of context, but, so what I do is when I find my cases, and I find several iterations of the same problem, then I can make different configurations of the case where I have different external circumstances or different personalities in the case or different governance relationship. And always remember, we're in the age of third-party government. So in a lot of these cases, you're going to have contractors. You're going to have nonprofit organizations. You're going to have, and maybe even another government or someone else. You might even have overlapping jurisdictions. So you'll have to keep in mind that these are not just, you don't want it to be too clinical where it's just like, Fred does this and Ginger says this and okay, and then they have to come to a decision at the end. Make sure you have this rich context because then you can have the students think really about these external pressures in government because we know in budgeting in particular, if it were all about just calculating numbers and never having opinions and never having anyone with opinions or opinions about what's, number is better than another, no, people have these opinions, they're there. And so just because you figure out something is the most efficient way to do it, that's not, you might have external pressures or even internal pressures to have it be a different way or a different set of values. So that's where I, really try to make it realistic in that it has a rich context. Has a lot of, and I give characters, you can give them funny names, whatever, but you can give whatever names, but you can really make them give a little bit of insight into their personality and their history with the decision point too. Why is it a hot button issue for them? Or why don't they care about the issue?
What a great setup. So, I also have been teaching cases for quite a while. One of my favorite cases was written by Jeff Strassman and Bill Duncombe. It's called the Northville Daycare case. I don't know if you've ever looked at it. It's very intense, but the learning outcome is they can create a program budget from scratch. That's fairly complex. And so in that case, I use groups. I tried it multiple ways, but I found that groups of about 3 or 4 students can do that case, and there's a part 1 and a part 2. And the part 1 is kind of creating a basic structure. Part 2 is bringing into realism. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I highly encourage you to look at that. So if you're interested in developing skills in Excel, for example, that is an excellent case to do that, which I think is one point we haven't really touched on. So it's really important to know why you're using a case, right? What is it that you want to do? So for me, it's always been, here's the theory, here are the set of readings that set up the thing I want them to understand, and now I want to understand them at a concrete level. I want them to understand if there's a contracting issue, is it a diversion, or is the real issue that the budget needs $2,500 the budget proposal is only $2,500 short, and instead of contracting for garbage with an iffy proposition, they just have to cut $2,500 out of the budget and the problem is solved. So I'm very big on problem definition. My course is all about problem definition in budgeting because how you define a problem sets up the solution set. This is out of my multiple rationalities framework that I approach everything in life. That's really important for me, is the theory-practice connection. And so I write a case so that it fills a practical side of the theory-practice connection. So what I want to show you here is the case that just was published in JPay is using the balancing act simulation. And so as an instructor, you would see that. So here's what the students see. And the idea for this case is I teach it at the very end. This is like the penultimate or ultimate class in the budgeting. So now the idea is to bring together all the things they've been talking about. And now they're in the situation where they have to make the value trade-offs. They have interest groups, so they play roles, right? So in the narrative for the case, which you can find on JPay now, you have students, the instructor's guide suggests how you set up different cases. So there's the business group, there's the neighborhood groups, there's the city council people, there's the city manager's office, there's the department heads. So all these people have different perspectives on how you should balance a budget, right? So then when they actually get to actually doing the case, they all have access to the simulation. Each group can define and set up their own solution, right? So they get this introduction, which is really just saying what there was done before. PFP donated $10,000 to Polko Balancing Act so that we could set up a special education version of simulation. And so instead of submitting, they saved their progress, and now they're going to share that in the class session, right? So here's our solution. And they have to write a memo to the city council stating their position, right? So when they do that, they have to go through and they're going to work on either the revenue side or the expenditure side or both. And so they go in, for example, one of the issues in fund balance, they can change the fund balance. Or they can go into capital projects, and there's a fire station that the fire department wants, and it needs $200,000 just for engineering. Well, they have a fire, so they can say, yeah, we're going to defer that. And now they just saved the money and so on. So the idea of this is that they have lots of different options, lots of different ways. For example, police officers. Do you want to keep police officers? Do you need all 4 of them, maybe 2 of them? Firefighters, emergency coordinators. So there's lots of different things. Like, so public safety and public works are 50 to 75% of local government general fund budget, right? So part of what I want them to know is you can tinker with the piddly squat stuff, but it is not going to get you $5 million. If you want $5 million, you either have to raise some revenues, or you have to make big political cuts like not funding the police positions, not filling the fire positions, because that's where the money is. So those are the concepts that they have to wrestle with, and they love the role playing. I mean, the people that are in business community are like, no new taxes, no. And then, that you set this conversation up going in the classroom, and they really get into the roles. I also have it's an online version and a classroom version. So in the online, they still play roles, but the timeline is a bit different, but it's all in discussion boards and so on and that kind of thing. So the idea here is that, for me, is I want them to face the realities of difficult choices, because that's what budgets are. And they're also value choices, right? And so this is where the rubber meets the road. You can have all the theory you want, but in the end, you need $5 million. And how are you going to get it? And they love the case. I always get great reviews on the case. The rest of the they're not so, but the case they love. So I think for me, that's really important for people just to understand. And you too, by the way, the reason I wanted to present this, every one of you has free access to Balancing Act by virtue of Polko. So you get a free educator account, and it's in the JPay article. You can get the directions, or you can just contact me directly, and I'll connect you with Polko. But you get your own educator account, and then you could either use the template, which is here, or you can actually create your own case, right? So you could do one of these, like if you wanted to do a capital budgeting case, you could just make the choices not about all these things, but just about all the capital budgeting stuff. You could have a whole list. In fact, with this Fox Falls case that we wrote for the ICMA book, Bill and I are actually going to take it and then create a simulation using that case so that it's really just focused on, it becomes a CIP budget, not the whole thing. So if you're interested, we got this money from PFP to do exactly that. So I really encourage you to take, it's really pretty fun to do, and it's pretty simple.
All right, thank you. So the next thing that I prompted the panelists to think about were some challenges and how to overcome them. So that at least as you plan ahead to work on writing these cases, you know some potential pitfalls and how to be proactive and potentially avoid them. So I'm going to start with Susie.
Yeah, so and I always try my cases out on my classes before I move them forward. I ask others to try them out, and but some cases work better than others. But there are some key things in the cases that you can know that have to be there, and things that you want to avoid. I also tell my students when I'm teaching the case, there are parameters. No, you didn't win the lottery and solve the budget deficit. That's not.
You can't make shit up.
Yeah, you can't make stuff up. I also limit them. So if they're writing a paper or doing a presentation, I limit them to just the facts of the case, and then that's taught with the theory that I want them to know. But they cannot go out on the internet and try to find examples or find write-ups, find things, because that's not what it's about. It's about their critical thinking about the case. So I try to get them to, I tell them, first of all, you're never going to find the case I wrote for your project because it doesn't exist. It's fiction, but it is based off of a series of cases. So don't try to go look it up somewhere, and you'd be surprised what they'll come up, what they'll try to do, as opposed to doing any thinking themselves, But also on AI, they type stuff in all the time and come up with stuff. So I've started actually using my cases and exams sometimes, because if I make it up and I have the pieces and I can figure the puzzle, they can look up on the AI all they want. It's not going to tell them the answers. So that's another benefit of it. But I always tell mine, you need to really consider all the stakeholders in the case, all the people in the case, and that's why it's so important that you write out who they are. So it's not just, you can just randomly bring in a character or bring in somebody that's having an impact on the decision or has an opinion on the decision. Develop them up front, and that I learned from my CMA cases. It's really like, Joan Westfield and the People Against Taxes Foundation or whatever. You can come up with different names for them, but having those groups laid out in there really gives them more of a realistic sense of that it's not just me that has to solve this problem, put myself in the shoes of the decision-making solving problem. I have to make other people happy in the process, meaning I have to maybe compromise or build some consensus. You can also, one of the things I used to not do that I learned that is really valuable is to have a media component to it. So what I mean by that is the local news said something about it, or there was a news story, or there's a soundbite or something that's out there, or so-and-so wrote something on Twitter or whatever. But getting those components in, that's where our students are at for how they're operating, right? It's not like we're sending memos anymore, like a lot of the older cases. But you got to get it relevant, and then, but also then, like, I think the AI proofing works when you switch your case up. If you were just to use the same case for an assignment over and over and over again, it wouldn't be long before all the answers would be available on ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever. So, and they might not always be right, because it's whoever wrote it that put it in there. So, But I would caution you, yeah. But I also just tell the students, use the parameters I'm giving you. Here's the readings for this, here's the case. Now, it's up to you to figure out how you can use the theory to drive the case, and then make them back up I always say, you need, always the whys are important, right? Make sure in the case you're having them back up their answers. So it can't just, you don't want a question to be just yes or no. Then there's no discussion of what the trade-offs are or anything, right? You've got to have whys in the question. You've got to have, why did you pick X over Y? Or why did you want them to think through that kind of logic, because otherwise, they'll just say, and there's nothing to discuss.
And so I think, I do want to highlight that. I think Susie's point really kind of goes back to the point that Kurt had made, is that you want to have kind of a fundamental idea of what is the key concept that you want students to get out of this teaching case. And then as you're developing the teaching case, you're not just going to hand students the case, you're also going to give them instructions on how to respond to the case. And then that needs to be part of your thinking as you develop the case, as well as what are the instructions, what are the parameters that I'm going to give the students as they analyze this, because it also then speaks to the point that I think Tatyana had made about how do you decide what is relevant to put in, and what do you omit that they have to make certain assumptions, or they have to kind of question certain assumptions. So I just wanted to remind that, yes, we write the teaching case, but that doesn't mean that it's a standalone case, that you kind of develop it in conjunction with maybe not something that's formally written, but you think about how are you going to use this in the classroom. So Tatyana, you're next.
Yeah, can I ask Susie, for example, before we move on, an example of case study that you used for the exams or the assignments?
Oh, yeah, well, so I write shorter versions of them for the exams and the assignments, and I've started doing that the last couple of years because of AI. So you can't just ask students questions like define the public interest, like that anymore. You can't do that. They'll go out and find it. They'll put stuff in. I want them using the material in the class, and I want them using. So I'll usually write a scenario, and then for each one, there's kind of a list of things I go through that I vary. And so one of them is it a surplus year, or is it a budget? Is it a budget economic downturn? And where is it coming from? Like, what is the source of it? Is it a pandemic? Is it a disaster? Is it a, found money or whatever? I mean, South Carolina apparently found money. I don't know if you saw that in the news, but the state found a chunk of millions of dollars that they didn't have it earmarked for anything, that was just sitting there. So, anyways, what is that, contest? One thing you can vary. And then make sure too, you're varying your characters. Don't make all the characters men that are the same age or whatever. Let's get some diversity in there, folks, okay? Women make decisions, did you know that?
The fire chief is a woman.
Yeah. So get some diversity in there too, and that's another piece that you can play around with, because certain issues are going to affect certain people different ways. And so, a woman might be very sensitive about her pay and how much she gets in a raise compared to a man, because women are systematically discriminated in the process. So there are these little things that, and the cultural things, like your female fire chief is a hard one to manage sometimes.
Well, it's because the Rockford fire chief is one of our alums, and she's the first female fire chief of Rockford, Illinois. And so I'm like, she's a female fire chief.
She's probably working against some subcultures there in the organization or things too. That's it too. But always draw that kind of context, and it's okay to make two characters in the case enemies. I think that makes it fun. I love it when it's like two people that get into kind of have a bad personal relationship, and then it kind of spills into it. It's one way to make it different, right? So I've been doing those where I just write maybe like a half page, could even be just 2 paragraphs with a decision dilemma, a real simple one, but then they have to bring in how they're gonna solve it. And I'll make them have to, for example, I will say they're using this budget format. How would this differ if they use this other type of format? If they're like, well, budget formats, right? So you have like, okay, so, this is an old line item, the antiquated budget, but then here I have this public management performance type, new performance type of budget that I'm contrasting for, what am I using, what are the techniques I'm using, and then contrast it to the other options. So sometimes it's really interesting because you can teach them budget formats, but it doesn't really sink in until they're actually dealing with the trade-offs.
All right, so in the spirit of kind of keeping us on track, I still want to go to our root cause, but if you could just identify some challenges and help our audience stay on top.
I'll be quick. So I think I have one challenge in mind and a solution probably too. So I said earlier that usually people like to share the stories, but usually it's not always. And it probably sounds obvious, but you have to ask for consent to use their names, their true information, true data, right, when you're writing the cases. Because if they really want to share the stories, everything, I think it makes story even more interesting when it's a true case, true names, true data, right? But if you cannot use true names and true data, that's when you can still, if it's an interesting situation, then you can convert it into a hypothetical, and maybe with different scenarios, right? You have this interesting thing that happened, but yeah, you come up with fake names and fake situations and fake environments and make it work.
Bruce?
Yeah, I'll kind of play off of what Susie said of, students will inevitably take every opportunity to figure out how to get something else to answer their questions for them. On more than one occasion, I've had students call the local police department for a case study that I've used and propose a hypothesis that I'm trying to reduce their budget, what would they do? And then I start getting phone calls from the police chief going, why are you trying to destroy me? So, thinking through, what students might potentially do or how they might potentially, get an answer outside of doing the work and trying to kind of, proactively address that. So the last couple times that I've done it, the police one, I have the last police chief for Raleigh, not the current one, was one of our alumni, so she would come and instead of having them call the police station, at the end, the class would present it to her. And then it gives her an opportunity to kind of give them feedback of what would have worked, what might not would have worked, so they can actively learn from that instead. And then also, it then kind of pre-alerts, an organization that might be slightly associated with the topic, even if you aren't using them by name, that this is kind of coming down the line a little bit.
Kurt?
Yeah, I think one thing that helps anticipate some of these things is I always think about writing the instructor note. So how could someone else teach this case? Then I have to explain why I've done whatever I've done, how to handle, I have to put on paper how will I handle the students and the role plays and whatever. I do think that the role play thing for cases is an effective way of getting around a bunch of problems. So it's not competition, like I don't have to get an A on this, I have to work with my other 2 or 3 students to play this role, and I'm playing a role that I don't have to believe. It's just the role I got assigned. So I think those are things that are helpful for thinking about things. So in the simulation that I've got here, it's actually based on Dubuque, Iowa, way back in 2018. So I did get consent from them, from the CFO and the city manager, to use their stuff, but it's called River City. So it's not called Dubuque. I had to wipe out as much Dubuque's. I mean, they had so many levels of Dubuque in the simulation. Search and find, search and delete. But it's helpful to to I think about how you would explain someone else to teach the case so that you are thinking through all the issues that would potentially come up.
All right, so the purpose of this workshop was really to be a working session, so I do want to give you some time to reflect on what our panelists have said and think about an idea for a teaching case that you could develop or that you could write. Keeping in mind, I don't have all of these details worked out, but eventually we would like to be soliciting teaching cases from you and your colleagues in a way that would allow us to make these more widely available and accessible to a larger audience, which is also why kind of that instructor note is going to be a really critical part of thinking about your case. So I'm going to give you some, like, JP.
I have too many questions.
Yeah, can you ask questions too?
Okay, so
Sorry,
let's pivot. If y'all maybe, I'll just seek assurances that after this workshop you'll take some time to think through some ideas. We'll pivot and open it up for some Q&A if that's okay with our panel. Sure. Okay, JP will kick us off and then over here. Yep.
So I'm going to link two questions together in terms of time. Besides like the example that Susie said about like budget formats, how often do you try to link the cases with the readings and with the literature of budgeting? That's one, and at the same time, if you could say how common is it that the cases will include something like a spreadsheet activities versus a more of public management or policy comparison?
So I always link readings to the case, because the case is designed to make the readings real. Two, I think it depends what is it you want students to know. So in the Northville daycare case, I want them to be able to come out of that with the competency that if they get told we need to go create, not a daycare necessarily, but you need to go create a sustainability program or whatever, they know how to from scratch think about what do I need, personnel and benefits. On another case, Lone Pine Daycare, I take David Ammons has the go-away cost analysis, because when people think about contracting, they're always thinking about, true cost accounting, and that's not how you think about this. So I want them to have to use go-away cost analysis, and they must use go-away cost analysis, and they have to use the framework that Ammons put in, and then they have the Lone Pine Daycare case, or Lone Pine trash case, and they have to analyze it using go-away costs. Because I want them to know that specific skill when they're thinking, someone says let's contract out, which is a big thing. This is a very simple tool, but super effective.
Pete?
Do you have any suggestions on how to make these evergreen in the sense that you can use them over and over again? I know there's, Kurt, it sounds like you've been using these things for decades. Do you have to change the fiscal year? Little things like that save you time that you build in, so you're not having to refresh those. If you all have any suggestions.
I think you have to these days. I don't think you can go without. Once it's presented as kind of spoiled to a certain extent. You need to, what's out there now with AI, you have to be able to be creative, and I was mentioning, just change some different external factors in the case, and it'll be different enough that they can't try to use previous people's.
Well, in the daycare case, Jeff and Bill wrote that in 2000. So it was $300 a month for infant childcare. And
What a
I still
great world.
So it's, in 2010, they're like, what? So I got permission from Jeff to upgrade it. So now the daycare case that's published in the NASPA repository is the updated version, which has like 2020, 2021 numbers. But now it takes like $1,000, a month for a kid. So some of those kinds of things, to keep it kind of current, you have to do some of those. But it depends on the case. If some aren't date bound. It's if it's an accounting control thing that Tatyana's talking about, it doesn't necessarily have to deal with the numbers. It's the thinking that has to be involved. So there's no really updating that you have to do.
Doug?
How do you prepare cases or teach cases on an asynchronous online class?
So that's why that thinking about an instructor note is important. So the role playing and stuff can still happen, but you just have to think about it in terms of what are the tools that you use, how does that platform work, and then you just have to try it out. Like, so I just got this published, but we've been doing it for 5 years. Tweaking, building, thinking about it, and so on before I'm ready to do this. I mean, I did share with some other people to try out. So Franklin Thurmaier and Erica Cheka, who are my doctoral students, who are now teaching in different places, they helped develop it. So Franklin actually takes this River City thing, and he actually has added Balancing Act as a priorities module, and so he actually adds that first, and then they do this. So we practiced, and you know, and I tell my students, so, but the first time I said, so I get to try something new. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but you can critique it all you want. Just don't yell at me, because I don't know if this is going to work. So I tried it out both classroom and online and had to tweak and so on. So you just have to kind of figure out how it might work.
I can add, I have one simulation, I run local simulation, local simulation on Zoom. I divide students into groups and they send them to their personal breakout rooms, and then we come back together in the end. It always, you know, I was not sure how it's going to work, but oh my gosh, they come back in the end and they're all pumped up and they're all like, I cannot even add a word because everybody's talking at once. You know, they're they're discussing their budget priorities and whether their needs and wants were met in the budget process.
Very quick, and thank you for organizing this super interesting session. Have you ever used teaching cases in PhD program classes?
Exams, actually comprehensive PhD.
But don't you need more time? I mean,
It takes time. I do it all the time.
because I have the impression that it helps a lot in understanding what happened at the ground level and connecting theories.
Yeah, I can write really short ones. They're just very much to the point.
And to me, many times, the difference between undergraduates or graduates or PhD students, and you can provide the same information, but you can ask different questions, right? Because, I mean, budget theory is a budget theory, so we covered certain topics, but then the level of analysis you ask for in your cases can be very different. And that's what I usually do.
Did you have anything to add? Okay, I saw a hand over here. Sharon.
Just to go back to your point, I think you can figure out if it's a slightly longer case, you can give it an hour or two before the exam begins so that you have some reading time and lead time. Sometimes you used to use financial statements for an exam, so let's say the day before, 12 hours or 24 hours before an exam, will give you the financial statement, so it gives them time to prep, so that by the time they come into the exam, you know, they think, oh, we'll get straight up ratio questions. And then you're like, no, it's not going to be a ratio. I want you to start thinking about strategy. And like, oh, this is not what I studied. So there are different ways to do that. On the point on how do you vary the cases, the daycare one, you go and change the workload. You go and change the revenue structure. You make these small tweaks, by the way, and it throws the students off completely. And they're like, what? It's a completely different case from what I did last year. I also tend to create staggered cases. So I have one on accounting, and I do the first year nonprofit is created, and the second year the nonprofit is created. So one cohort gets the first year, the next cohort gets the second year, and then the following cohort gets the first year. And you change the number. So 1 year I'm paying somebody $3,000 a month. Next year I'm paying them $2,745. Again, when you do the balance sheet, the numbers look completely different. And then I think just to add one point, Tatyana mentioned about special audits. You would not believe the narrative you would get from a federal indictment. Those are the best like miniature Dateline type of investigations. Those ones just go into detail about the story behind the embezzlement, and it will give you such a rich material to develop a case. You would not believe it. And those federal indictments, most of them you can just do a Google search and they're available, so it's not like you have to do a full
So just the same kind of idea of like the federal indictments looking for stuff. Before he passed away, Charlie Coe wrote a book of vignettes. And they're not full case studies, most of them like a paragraph long, but it's literally a book of here's funny and strange incidents that have happened in governments and nonprofits from the news around the US that he collected over the years. So you can kind of flip through there and find a story that kind of lines up and then start pulling some of the background information that you need to for it if you are looking for ideas but don't have one that you know of offhand.
All right, so I think that is a great stopping point because again, your homework is to think of ideas for some teaching cases so that we can enrich the tools and the resources that are available for all of us to, as part of our teaching tools and things. So thank you to the panelists and thank you to all of you.